Gentlemen, here's a question that might sting a bit. How many times have you been told to man up or keep your emotions under lock and key? Society seems obsessed with the idea of a strong man being a stoic, unshakable pillar of strength. But here's where it gets tricky. While men are expected to be emotionally controlled, women often misread, undervalue, or even dismiss the emotions you do express. Let's talk about it because let's be real, there's a massive disconnect here. Men have feelings too, complex, deep, and real. But for generations, many women haven't been taught how to understand them. Instead, they've been handed clichés about male stoicism or outdated assumptions that oversimplify how men think and feel. As a result, women sometimes look at men and say, "You're so hard to read," or worse, "You just don't care." Sound familiar? But it's not all their fault, is it? For centuries, men have been conditioned to downplay or outright hide their emotions. You've been told to bury your struggles, keep a stiff upper lip, and soldier on without a hint of vulnerability. Here's the irony. Many women say they want an emotionally open partner, yet society as a whole has done little to make men feel safe to open up. It's a paradox we need to confront, and this conversation is long overdue. So today, I'm going to unpack the tangled dynamics between women and men's feelings, what women might be missing, where men might be holding back, and how we can bridge this emotional gap. Because the truth is, men's feelings aren't a mystery. They're human, they're valid, and they deserve to be understood just as much as anyone else's. Ready? Let's dig into it. 1. Why do women assume men are emotionless? Let's get straight to it. Many women assume men don't feel as deeply as they do because society has programmed them to think so. From childhood, boys are taught to shake it off and hide their tears. That lesson doesn't just stop at scraped knees. It evolves into adulthood, where expressing pain, sadness, or even fear can often feel like a crime against masculinity. Here's the kicker. Women see this emotional restraint and interpret it as indifference. To them, a lack of visible emotion can seem cold or detached. But here's the reality most women don't grasp. Men feel just as much, if not more, than they do. The difference is that men often process emotions in silence, using internal mechanisms like problem solving, compartmentalizing, or simply retreating into their minds. Now here's where the controversy deepens. When a woman opens up emotionally, she often expects a similar level of openness in return. And when that doesn't happen, frustration sets in. She might think he doesn't care, or worse, he doesn't feel anything. The truth, however, is far more complex. Men do feel, they just express it differently. Unfortunately, many women aren't attuned to recognizing these subtle forms of communication, whether it's the sigh before an honest thought or the quiet action that speaks louder than words. Adding fuel to the fire, the media hasn't helped. Movies and TV shows often portray men as stoic heroes or bumbling fools incapable of navigating their own emotions. While women have seen increased representation of emotional complexity in recent years, men are still largely depicted as emotionally one-dimensional. This reinforces the stereotype that men are fundamentally less emotional or empathetic. But let's flip the lens for a second. Can we really blame women for this assumption? Men have been trained to suppress, trained not to cry, trained not to talk about their feelings because doing so might make them weak in a world that values their strength above all else. Women have been conditioned to see this facade, not the real, raw, emotional depth lurking beneath. The solution? Women need to challenge this assumption, but it starts with men embracing their feelings unapologetically. Vulnerability isn't a weakness, it's strength, and it's time women and men start seeing it that way. 2. The strong silent type myth. How society conditions men to hide feelings. Let's talk about one of the biggest lies society has sold to men, the strong silent type. You've seen it everywhere. The quiet hero in movies, the emotionally unshaken leader, the stoic man who carries the world on his shoulders without so much as a frown. It sounds noble, right? But here's the reality. This expectation has become a prison for countless men, forcing them to suppress their feelings and ignore their emotional health. From a young age, boys are subtly, and sometimes not so subtly taught that silence equals strength. The messages come from everywhere: family, school, friends, and media. Crying is for girls. Be a man. Don't let them see you weak. The result? Men learn to internalize their pain and struggles, choosing silence over self-expression. Worse, they often assume this silence is the price of being respected. Now here's where it gets tricky. Many women unknowingly reinforce this myth. Women may praise a man for being so composed or admire his ability to keep it together, not realizing they're applauding the very behavior that isolates him emotionally. And when women do seek vulnerability, they often want it only at a level they're comfortable with. A man who bears too much, too soon, may find himself labeled as too sensitive or overwhelming. It's a lose-lose situation. But let's clear something up. Being the strong, silent type doesn't mean men don't feel. It means they've been trained to hide what they feel. The emotions are still there, bubbling beneath the surface, often coming out in unexpected or unhealthy ways, like anger, withdrawal, or self-doubt. The silence isn't strength, it's an emotional survival strategy. The impact of this conditioning is profound. Men often grow up emotionally isolated, unable to articulate their struggles. This disconnect can make them harder to understand for their partners, creating rifts in relationships. It's also one of the reasons men are less likely to seek support for mental health issues, which only perpetuates the cycle of silence and suffering. To break this myth, both men and women need to rewrite the narrative. Strength isn't about silence, it's about balance. True masculinity embraces courage and vulnerability. The first step? Dismantling the idea that a man's worth lies in his ability to hide what hurts him. 3. Mixed signals. When women ask for vulnerability but struggle to handle it. Here's a situation many men can relate to. You're told to open up, to share what's really on your mind or heart, only to find that when you do, it's met with confusion, discomfort, or even frustration. It feels like walking into a trap, damned if you keep it in, but somehow still damned when you let it out. This isn't a small issue. It cuts deep into how men and women connect emotionally. On the surface, women often say they want a man who's emotionally open. It's a common refrain. I just want him to be real with me, or I need him to talk about his feelings. But when a man does let his guard down, the reality can look very different. Women, like society at large, aren't always prepared for the weight of male vulnerability. Here's the relatable truth. Men don't share their feelings for fun. When a man opens up, it's not because he's looking for pity or to burden anyone. It's because he trusts the person enough to let them into his carefully guarded world. So when that trust is met with criticism, dismissal, or even subtle discomfort, it doesn't just sting, it confirms his worst fears about being vulnerable. And let's be honest, ladies, sometimes women unconsciously fall back on the same societal conditioning they criticize. Many women expect men to be their emotional rock, the steady hand that never falters. But here's the paradox. You can't demand a partner be a fortress and also expect them to crumble in your arms. The problem isn't that women don't care. It's that they often underestimate the complexity of what they're asking for. Vulnerability isn't pretty. It's raw, messy, and sometimes uncomfortable. And for many women, seeing a man they love in pain can feel unsettling. The immediate instinct might be to fix it, dismiss it, or even pull away from it. Not because they don't care, but because they don't always know how to handle it. For men, this dynamic feels impossible to navigate. How much should you say? What's too much? Do you risk being misunderstood, judged, or seen differently? The constant second-guessing leads many men to keep it all bottled up instead, perpetuating the cycle of emotional miscommunication. To break this cycle, there must be mutual understanding. Vulnerability is a two-way street. If women want men to open up, they must create a space where it's genuinely safe to do so, free of judgment or unrealistic expectations. 4. The emotional divide. What women misunderstand about men's needs. Let's address something that often gets overlooked. The emotional disconnect that exists between men and women isn't entirely one-sided. Sure, women may struggle to fully understand how men process feelings, but men aren't always clear about their emotional needs either. This divide isn't a battle of blame. It's a challenge that requires both sides to wake up and do better. Women sometimes misunderstand men's needs because they assume men's silence means they don't have any. But here's a truth that can't be ignored. Men crave emotional support and connection just as much as anyone else. The problem is that men often fail to ask for it. Society teaches men to provide, protect, and endure, but rarely does it teach them to communicate when they're struggling or in need of emotional care. Men, this is where the wake-up call comes in. If you want to bridge this emotional divide, you've got to stop expecting women to read your mind. Holding everything in and hoping someone notices what's wrong is a recipe for frustration on both sides. You may think you're sparing her by not burdening her with your problems, but in reality, you're creating distance. She can't support you if she doesn't know what's going on. Women, on the other hand, need to let go of certain assumptions too. Men's needs might not always look the same as theirs, but they're no less valid. It's not always about sitting down to talk for hours. It might be about small gestures, physical presence, or shared activities that make men feel cared for and valued. Understanding these differences takes effort, patience, and a willingness to step outside familiar patterns. Here's the real criticism, though. Men, you have to step up for yourselves. The emotional divide will never close if you keep retreating into your shells every time things get difficult. Being vulnerable isn't a weakness, and asking for what you need doesn't make you less of a man, it makes you human. Ultimately, men and women need to recognize that emotional support is a partnership. It's about meeting in the middle, communicating openly, and respecting each other's differences. Men, the world won't hand you emotional clarity on a silver platter. You have to take charge of it yourself. Wake up to your emotional reality and be willing to share it. 5. Bridging the gap. How men and women can break the cycle. If there's one thing we can all agree on, it's this. The current emotional divide isn't working for anyone. Men often feel misunderstood or unseen, while women are left wondering why they can't seem to connect in the way they want. But here's the good news. It doesn't have to stay this way. Bridging the gap is possible, and it starts with both men and women being willing to unlearn old habits and take action. For men, breaking the cycle begins with self-awareness. Understand that vulnerability isn't about dumping your emotions on someone, but about being authentic and honest about how you feel. Stop hiding behind the excuse that no one will understand you. It's not about whether they understand perfectly, it's about opening the door to connection. Start small. Share your thoughts, your worries, your dreams in ways that feel natural to you. Women, your role in this is just as important. Instead of expecting men to express emotions in the way you do, focus on truly listening. Pay attention to the ways men communicate feelings beyond words. It could be through their actions, their silences, or even their frustrations. Create a space where men feel safe to be vulnerable without fear of judgment, ridicule, or overreaction. For both sides, empathy is the key. Men and women don't always process emotions the same way, and that's okay. But trying to see things through each other's eyes is where the magic happens. Acknowledge each other's efforts, even when they fall short. Nobody is perfect at expressing feelings, and missteps are inevitable. The important thing is to keep trying. Now here's where it gets challenging. Consistency is everything. Men, don't share once and expect a perfect outcome. Vulnerability takes practice, and trust takes time. Women, don't retreat if your first attempt to bridge the emotional gap doesn't meet your expectations. Patience and understanding will make the process smoother for both sides. At its core, breaking this cycle isn't just about better relationships. It's about creating a culture where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued. Men and women are different, yes, but those differences can complement each other when approached with curiosity and respect. The gap isn't permanent unless we allow it to be. Step by step, conversation by conversation, we can rewrite the narrative. Here's the hard truth. The emotional disconnect between men and women exists because both sides have failed each other. Men, your silence has robbed women of truly knowing you. Women, your assumptions have kept men locked in a box of outdated expectations. Breaking this cycle is not just possible, it's necessary. What's your experience? Have you felt misunderstood or dismissed, no matter which side you're on? Drop a comment below. Let's start a conversation, because the more we share, the closer we get to understanding each other. I'll personally respond to as many as I can, so let's connect and break this barrier together.